and welcome to another evening of frank conversation here on Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. I'm Maupe Ogun Yusuf. A lot of events happened this week. Some very tragic, like the loss of 36 of our soldiers in an attack and an air crash in Niger State. And others have elicited a lot of discussions, like the assignment of portfolios to ministers who have now been confirmed. But of all that happened this week, a matter brought up for discussion by the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, the ICPC, is what Hard Copy will be considering this evening. On Tuesday, the Commission hosted a policy dialogue on corruption, social norms, and behavior change. There is a general consensus amongst Nigerians that we have a problem with corruption. And there is almost no place where it has not been felt, from security to healthcare to the economy and our education. It's so bad it's been blamed for a removal of government subsidies on petrol, whose cost has now spiraled out of the reach of ordinary people. In 2015, one of the tripods upon which the Buhari-led administration came to power was a promise to fight corruption. By 2023, when it left, corruption seems to have grown into such a fearful monster that very little was heard amongst presidential candidates about tackling it. And that's why the dialogue which the ICPC initiated is interesting. It's essentially asking if our culture encourages corruption, making it difficult to tackle. My guest tonight is Professor Olatunde Babawale, who is the Provost of the Anti-Corruption Academy of Nigeria, which is run by the ICPC. Professor Babawale, welcome to Hard Copy.
Thank you very much, Marpa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, a real deep food for thought, which you presented for discussion this week. And I was wondering what gave rise to that particular topic.
Thank you very much. The reason why that was brought up can be seen from two perspectives. The first, of course, is that ICPC, as you know, is empowered to tackle corruption and other related crimes, and that is backed by law. That is ICPC Act of 2000. Now, having existed for about 23 years, the Commission found out that the strategy for tackling corruption, which it had been used to, is what we call the law and order approach, identifying people who have engaged in acts of corruption, possibly prosecuting them, and enforcing the rules, as it were. But in spite of years of punishment to people, prosecution of people, apprehension of people who engage in corrupt acts, it was found out that corruption still persisted. Indeed, it festered. It's not just limited to Nigeria. It's just that the Nigerian case is exceptional because it's going at a double digit than it is in many other places. So we began to think of how to address the problem. That is there something wrong with this strategy? If there's nothing wrong with this strategy, what do we have to do? It was realized that there was nothing essentially wrong with this strategy, but that there is a need to complement it with another strategy in order to cope with the enormity of the task of fighting corruption. And so internationally, scholars began to come up with the idea of what they call a behavior change approach to fighting corruption. Indeed, the MacArthur Foundation has been one agency that has funded research in this area and is indeed also giving grant, to the ICPC to adopt this approach and popularize it and give a lot of publicity to it and see that it adopts it in its operations, which is what we are doing.
What does it mean? I mean, what does it entail, behavior change approach? Now,
what it means is that human beings exhibit behavior, specific type of behavior, depending on the context where they are. You know that a person grows up having been born by the parents within a particular environment. And that's why psychologists will talk about nature and nurture. So the environment in which you grow up is also important, apart from who or where or who gave birth to you. So what behavior change approach means is that we need to target people's behavior, their mindset, to corruption. One of the tragedies of our circumstance in Nigeria is that we have a very high tolerance level. We have developed it over time. Unfortunately, that was not the practice in years gone by, say 30 years ago. But the situation has gradually deteriorated to the point that we are no longer shocked. I believe that if anybody says a public servant has stolen 200 billion today, it will be in the corner of a newspaper. It may not attract a front page attention. And people will move on after about a week of discussing it in the newspapers. That is because our tolerance level for corruption no longer makes us to be shocked by the exposure. And when you get to school as a child in the primary school and something happens, maybe your friend drops a pen and you are thinking that the man didn't know the pen dropped and you wanted to pick it, something will tell you honesty is the best policy. You pick it up and give it to the owner. That hardly happens now because in the last 20 years, for example, I've not seen a lorry that has honesty is the best policy on his body, meaning that gradually we are phasing that out. The second point is that our parents used to tell us, remember the son or daughter of whom you are. If you are going on holidays to visit your relation, they will say, where you are going, you have to be careful, put up a good behavior, avoid acts that could bring the family or your own name into disrepute. But now, when your children are even going abroad, people hardly say, remember the son or daughter of whom you are. Those norms that we grew up then helped in cleansing society, in making us to develop a negative attitude towards corruption. But unfortunately, things have changed. Today, what do we have? What we have is that gradually a lot of parents don't really care about what happens to their children. Let me give you a typical example. If, as a young man in those days, you were given a gift by somebody who visited the house, you needed to take that gift, especially if it is money, disclose to your parent that this is what the person who came gave you. They will help you keep it. Now the tendency, I'm not saying everybody, but a majority, when they take that kind of gift, they go out and buy sweet and biscuit with them. And what did that teach them at that time? It taught them accountability, transparency. But we are no longer doing that.
Okay, so that generation that learned honesty is the best policy. They are the generation currently in power.
Yeah.
They are the generation currently in charge of things.
Yeah.
Why is it that that hasn't translated into, them teaching their own children about honesty being the best policy?
Yeah.
Why haven't they passed those same values on to their own children?
Yes.
The big fundamental questions there.
Yeah, I agree with you. My answer to that is that the context has changed. The context in which this thing about honesty being the best policy grew up is different. We now have a system, a cultural context, as I said before, in which corruption has become normalized. Now, what do I mean by that? When you say corruption has become normalized, it means that it is accepted. It is also expected. So when corruption is expected and accepted at the same time, it becomes a normal pattern of behavior. So we are living in a context created by, I agree, a lot of these people. And having created it, we are not fighting it consciously to ensure that we hand over a better society, a better system, a better environment, a better society to our own children. And what is responsible? First, the problem of poor implementation of sanctions, which makes a lot of people to escape with it. When you believe that the negative consequences of getting involved in corruption is less burdensome than accumulating wealth that comes from corruption, then you don't give a damn about whether you are accused of corruption or not. Secondly, when the society itself admires corruption and celebrates it, it becomes accepted, it becomes normal, and people don't see anything bad about it. So what we need to begin to think of now is how to create a new Nigeria and new Nigerians that will frown at corruption, that will indeed stigmatize those who engage in corrupt act. For example, we carried out a survey at the academy in 2019. And what did we do about that survey? We surveyed corruption attitude, perception, and experience of public officials in 2019. And we found out that about 69% of public officials in Nigeria that we surveyed admitted that if they go to their communities and donated money that is equivalent to their annual salary, nobody was going to ask questions. Whereas in the years gone by that I talked about, some 30, 40 years ago, if you are in your town, in your community, and you suddenly come across unearned and unexplained wealth, you will become ostracized. People will begin to tell their children not to go near your house because they don't know the source of the money that you have. Indeed, it will be a taboo for children from other homes to play with the children of that person. But today, the practice is different in the sense that when somebody comes across sudden wealth in the village, he is venerated. They begin to even think of how to give him chieftaincy titles. And then it becomes a role model, unquote, for others. This is the context. So we now have a cultural context in which corrupt people are venerated and respected instead of being stigmatized and condemned, in which corruption is celebrated.
Well, some people will say that, you know, this also reflects on our approach, because some people think that this discussion cannot be happening from the bottom up.
Yeah.
It has to come from the top down, because they believe that, you know, the leadership too hasn't shown sufficient will in how it has tackled corruption. But before I come to that, I also want to raise the issue of the fact that, you know, we seem to live in a society of contradictions, because this, whilst it is that, you know, maybe you no longer see trucks that have honesty is the best policy, people still appreciate acts of honesty. It does appear that when society sees these acts, and, you know, it is now newsworthy. It's such that, you know, we're trying to show that these sort of acts are still appreciated. I think a young lady who's from River State, she returned some money in Eco Hotel. Yes, she was celebrated by her own community. Yes. So it does appear that these sort of behaviors, I mean, these positive behaviors are still appreciated. Yes. The question is the government of the day, because what the community might be doing, you know, might be within their own efforts as a community. Well, how is government, when we look at our own national honors list, for instance, how are they appreciating those kinds of people? Are we honoring the kind of people we think that people should emulate?
Yeah, that's the question that we're asking. There is nothing to say that there are no such cases or deviations from the pattern of celebrating corruption. We have a lot. And what we're advocating is that we should celebrate those ones more, not making them isolated cases that are rarely celebrated. ICPC, for example, has an anti-corruption summit, which it organizes annually. And I'm sure you are aware, you have moderated some sessions there. And you will discover that a very important aspect of that annual summit is the celebration of those who demonstrate integrity in their places of work, who are relatively unknown. There was a lady who found money in the restroom in Lagos, in the airport, on about 3 occasions, and returned those monies in hard currency. She was celebrated the last time. We had the case of a PhD student who is Nigerian, who was studying in Japan and found hard currency in Japan and returned it to the authorities. They even called him back to come and take some part of it. He refused and said he didn't submit, didn't return it because he wanted to be compensated. So we have such instances. But what we are saying is that we should make those more newsworthy than celebrating those who we know got money that are not earned through very illegal and questionable means, which is what is happening in our country. So it must not just be some isolated communities. It must be, for instance, today in every village, you have several instances of people demonstrate honesty. How many of those cases are in the news? That's what we're saying.
Well, let's take a break at this point. When we come back, we'll be talking about the leadership. I mean, the ICPC is making its own effort, but the question is it also translating to, the expectations that that we have of our leadership in terms of tackling corruption. In a moment, please stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Hard Copy, coming to you from our studios in Abuja. We're talking tonight and asking if our culture and traditions have any influence on the monster called corruption. Professor Olatunde Babawale is the provost of the Anti-Corruption Academy of Nigeria and is our guest. So, Prof, let's talk about the leadership, because what the ICPC is doing, some people say it's commendable. We've seen new life in terms of its own interventions within its own mandate. But then it would seem that it's acting as a silo by itself. How is it translating to the attitude of those who govern us? Is the ICPC able to exert any influence, within those spheres?
I think I can say yes, but just to a certain extent. It may not be as much as we would want. Every program that we organize, such as the policy dialogue that you referred to earlier, once we end the program, we put together recommendations to government. When we do our analysis of annual budget, for example, which we started a few years back, we send recommendations to government. When we track constituency projects and we come up with reports of how people, instead of doing the project, converting it into their personal property, we make recommendations to government. Some of those recommendations have been implemented, I must confess, but many of them have also not been implemented. So I hope that what is clear now is that everybody is a loser in this game of corruption. We must begin to realize that nobody wins, including those who have acquired unearned wealth. The level of insurgency that we have now can be partly traced to the deprivation of countless number of youths who had nothing to do. And today, because those youths are not sleeping, the rich in those communities are now more or less marooned in Abuja and Lagos. They can't go to their villages. These are the implications of corruption. The dilapidated roads, the very decrepit healthcare delivery system. We all witness to the pathetic case of the female medical doctor that died because of the problem of the elevator. Now, these are things that happen because of acts of corruption. And we must begin to see that everyone is a loser at the end of the day. In any society, leadership is everything. It is the leadership that those who constitute the followership emulate in their behavior, in their actions. And the ruling ideas, as Karl Marx once said, in any society, is the idea of the ruling class. So we need a lot of members of the ruling class to set good examples. When the examples are set, we are likely to have those at the bottom behaving well. The problem with us is that those in the leadership over the years have not been setting good examples. And how are we correcting that? First, we continue to do our job as we have always done, and we need government to encourage us. We, at the level of ICPC, can confirm that we don't suffer from any interference. That is important. Making the anti-corruption agencies independent, and then guaranteeing also the independence of the judiciary. These are ways by which we can strengthen the system of adjudication and ensure that the guilty does not go unpunished. That's number one. The second point, which is the crux of our discussion today, has to do with the role that social norms play. As you know, that social norms are actually the unwritten codes, the unwritten codes, the unspoken pattern of behavior of a particular group of people. And it shows how they ought to behave in a particular situation. So if we see any aspect of our culture, like I've talked about, for example, the veneration for those who acquire money through illegal means, the refusal to give them chieftaincy titles, the refusal by churches to accept donations from people whose means of livelihood cannot be ascertained. These are signals that we need to send to the rest of society. The fact that parents should do more work on their children. When your child brings from school something that doesn't belong to him, you must chastise the child and ensure that the thing is delivered to the owner. When a person gets political office today, the expectation in his community is that he should use that office for the benefit of the community, attract roads, attract employment, without taking cognizance of the fact that those benefits themselves can constitute acts of corruption. And what do I mean by constituting act of corruption? When you are presiding over the employment of people in an office and you bring in only people from your local government, that's nepotism, and that is corruption. Again, people expect that once somebody gets public office, this is Nigeria, that's the truth. It has become a norm that the person must also use that for his own benefit. So that if somebody refuses to do that and he leaves office after 4 years, they begin to ridicule him and ask questions. What did he do with his life that having spent 4 years as minister, we didn't see a new house, we didn't see a new car? Furthermore, now, everybody, many people in the civil service have accepted the wrongdoing, which is that you should be compensated, you should be thanked for an official job that you have done, because they begin to see the work they do, which is their duty as civil servant, as a favor.
Oh, thanks in what manner? Okay, that's thanks by the people?
That people, when those that for whom you have given service, needs to express gratitude. For instance, if in an office you have a contractor applies for job and he's gotten the job and he needs to process his papers, those who are processing the file expect that after they must have done their job, the man should thank them. This has become established. It is ordinary, but it is not. It is an act of corruption because it goes beyond merely saying thank you. Sometimes you put an envelope, you put something in an envelope. And the people themselves have begun to think it is right, because we also conducted that survey that I referred to earlier. We found out that the majority of those we surveyed who are public servants said there was nothing wrong with it.
Are you surprised, though? I mean, talking about, we just concluded an election, and
yes,
we've seen just how they are still being contested in court, and as the case might be. But are you surprised that so far so good, we haven't quite heard anything very concrete from this administration in terms of a fight against corruption?
I am apprehensive because I would want that to happen. And I think that it's important that this be done because it sends the right signals to the anti-corruption agencies to be up and doing and to up their game. It also sends the right signals to the rest of society that the government means business. We cannot pretend that we don't have a problem of corruption. It's mammoth, it is gargantuan, and it has to be addressed. If we are silent about it, it will remain a cancer that it has become, and it will eat and destroy the country. We have just talked about instances of people who have demonstrated acts of integrity that needs to be celebrated. We must purge the list of those who are given national honors and begin to seek for people who are genuinely deserving. It's not just members of the National Assembly or politicians that are deserving of national honors. There are people in the remotest of villages that are doing great things that should be encouraged. So we need to change that. I think the second thing that needs to be done, as I said before, is to begin to compel the leadership to lead by example. Thirdly, government has an important role. It must create a conducive environment for whistleblowers to do their job. Those who have complaints to make about acts of corruption must be encouraged, must be protected. These are things that need to be done. But I must also add that the environment itself, which makes people to be more easily disposed towards corruption, should be addressed. And what is that environment? We lack social protection measures, especially in the public service. How do you take care of the salaries of workers so it can make it possible for them to meet their basic needs? How do you address the problem of economic inequality, income inequality? How do you address the problem of poverty? These are realities that people face. Because when a man or woman is pushed to the wall, he may not have a choice than to begin to tamper with what he should not tamper with. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach.
Well, Prof, work is certainly not easy, and we certainly hope that, you know, you'll be successful in all that you set out to do with regards to the fight against corruption.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming on Hard Copy.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's where we'll wrap up the program tonight. However, we want to hear from you. What aspect of our culture do you think encourage corruption, if at all it does? Do use the handles showing on your screen to talk to us. Thank you for watching. I'm Mao Yusuf. Good night.